The word landed without weight, which was what made it dangerous. The executives are visiting tomorrow. Stay home. I don't want them to see this misunderstanding. He said it casually, his thumb moving across his phone screen as if he were scrolling past something irrelevant. A headline, a notification. Me. For a moment, I honestly didn't realize I was the subject of the sentence. The office was unusually quiet for late afternoon, that hollow corporate silence filled only by the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant clicking of someone else's keyboard. His tone had the softness of policy, not malice, polished and impersonal, like it had already been approved by HR. I looked around, half expecting someone else to be standing behind me, some temporary hire, some intern with poor timing, but there was no one. Just the glass walls, the muted gray carpet, the reflection of fluorescent lights on polished desks, and him, leaning back in his chair, authority compressed into posture. This misunderstanding. The word echoed in my head, expanding, mutating. It wasn't confusion, not error. It was a dismissal disguised as professionalism. I felt my body respond before my emotions caught up. My shoulders tightened. My jaw locked. Years of training had taught me restraint, well before it taught me confidence. I nodded, slow and deliberate, committing the moment to memory. "Of course," I said. My voice sounded steady. That surprised me. He hummed softly in reply, approval without gratitude, and finally looked up long enough to offer a thin smile. It was the kind managers practice in front of mirrors, one that indicates closure rather than connection. Good. We'll avoid unnecessary complications. Avoid. As if I were a spill on the carpet, a glitch in the system. I turned back to my desk, aware of his eyes on me for half a second longer than necessary. Then they dropped again, back to whatever small, glowing world obeyed him more willingly than real people ever could. My screen was still open, rows of figures frozen mid-calculation. Numbers didn't flinch when you insulted them. Numbers didn't need permission to exist. The anger came quietly. Not the explosive kind that makes you reckless, but the precise kind that sharpens focus. The kind that reorganizes priorities. 2 years. That's how long I had been here. 2 years of arriving early, leaving late, absorbing responsibility without title, fixing problems no one wanted traceable fingerprints on. The department had been failing when I arrived. Bloated processes, vague strategies, elaborate presentations that said nothing. I had dismantled that piece by piece, carefully enough that no one felt threatened. Until now. I replayed the moment again, studying it from every angle. He hadn't said my name. That mattered. When people refuse to name you, it's because names carry acknowledgement, responsibility, ownership. I saved my work, shut down my computer, and stood. The motion drew his attention again. "Everything all right?" he asked, already bored with the answer. "Yes." Another smile. Another nod. Dismissed. The elevator ride down was slow, every floor marked by a quiet chime that sounded like a countdown. In the reflective metal walls, I barely recognized my own expression. Calm, composed, professional. No cracks. No betrayal of intent. That was important. Power is often less about force than about timing. Outside, the evening air felt heavier, charged. Streetlights flickered on one by one, illuminating the sidewalks like a calculated reveal. Somewhere above me, in that glass building, decisions were being made with the assumption that I would comply. And maybe that's what he expected. That I would stay home. That I would obey the soft command wrapped in polite language. that I would take the word and carry it quietly like I always had. I smiled to myself, the kind no one else could see. Misunderstanding, I thought. Yes, that was exactly what this was. The elevator doors closed with a muted sigh, sealing me into a vertical tunnel of brushed steel and reflected faces. Mine looked calm. It always does when the stakes are highest. The numbers above the door lit up one by one as we descended, each floor a pause long enough for my thoughts to rearrange themselves into something useful. 20%. The figure surfaced immediately, uninvited, sharp, and undeniable. It wasn't a boast. It was a fact. 2 years ago, the department's performance reports had been padded with optimism and footnotes, progress defined more by language than outcome. Now the graphs curved upward without explanation. Clean growth, sustained performance, no market miracle to credit. Just structural changes, ruthless prioritization, and decisions that required someone willing to be blamed if they failed. That someone had been me. I stepped out into the lobby, nodding to the security guard who had seen me arrive earlier than everyone else for months and leave long after the lights on my floor went dark. Outside, the city moved with indifferent efficiency. Traffic signals blinked. People crossed streets with eyes glued to screens. Businesses opened and closed whether they thrived or not. Systems rewarded results, not intentions. That was supposed to be the rule here, too. I walked the long way home. Movement helps me think. The phrase replayed again. Misunderstanding. It was elegant in its vagueness. If challenged, it could mean anything. A misalignment, a temporary confusion, a structural anomaly. It suggested error without blame, wrongness without responsibility. Most importantly, it reduced me to a variable instead of a contributor. I smiled faintly as I crossed the street. He knew better. He had approved every proposal I'd submitted, signed off on process changes without reading them too closely, trusting that I wouldn't fail loudly enough to attract attention. When early metrics came in stronger than expected, he'd leaned back in meetings and spoken about our direction, our strategy, with the kind of ownership that costs nothing. Sooner or later, someone was bound to notice patterns. Executives always did. They rarely understood the work itself, but they could read outcomes. And when outcomes became consistent, they asked questions they'd ignored before. Dangerous questions. Questions that required names. That was what tomorrow represented. At my apartment, I left my coat on the chair and went straight to my laptop. Old habits. The screen glowed to life, filling the room with cool, artificial clarity. I didn't open new files. I didn't need to. Everything was already cataloged, time-stamped, version-controlled. I believe in preparation, but I believe more in inevitability. If the truth is structured correctly, it moves on its own. The dashboard loaded slowly, displaying months of performance indicators I could navigate blindfolded. Revenue increases broken down by quarter. Cost reductions aligned with efficiency gains rather than layoffs. Client retention curves smoothing out as satisfaction metrics stabilized. The narrative was coherent. That mattered. I leaned back, hands folded, letting the data sit there between me and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Numbers demand interpretation, but they resist distortion. You can lie about reasons. You cannot lie about patterns, not for long. He was afraid. Not of me personally, not overtly. Fear like his is more refined. It's the fear of exposure without scandal, replacement without ceremony. The kind of fear that wakes executives at night, not because something is wrong, but because something else might be right enough to make them irrelevant. I closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling. Staying home would have been compliance. It would have allowed him to frame the discussion before it began, to contextualize my absence as prudence, discretion, professionalism. Executives prefer absence. It simplifies narratives. The less they see, the more they accept. But my absence would also have been conspicuous. If results are discussed, people eventually ask who produced them. Evading that question requires more effort than answering it, which made tomorrow interesting. I checked my phone. No messages, no follow-up. The instruction had been delivered as a conclusion, not a dialogue. He assumed that would be enough. People in authority often mistake silence for agreement. They forget how often it's just a pause. I stood and went to the small mirror near the door, adjusting nothing, simply observing. Composure isn't about confidence. It's about consistency. Tomorrow, whatever happened, I would need to be exactly the same version of myself I had always been. Rational, precise, unimpressed by theatrics. In the bathroom, I washed my hands, watched the water run clear, and thought about credentials. Not degrees or titles. Those were ceremonial. Real credentials accumulate quietly. They exist in solved problems, in crises that never escalated because someone intervened early. They are invisible until someone tries to erase them. That rarely works. When I turned off the light and stood in the darkness, I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not anticipation. Something closer to alignment. Tomorrow was not a rebellion. It was a correction. If he wanted to call me a misunderstanding, that was his choice. I knew exactly what I was. I stayed in the office long after the last ambient light shut itself off. Not because I had to, because I chose to. The building changes at night. During the day, it performs. Screens glowing, phones ringing, people moving with purpose they can explain to themselves if asked. At night, the performance ends. What's left is structure, infrastructure, truth stripped of commentary. My floor was silent except for the muted whir of servers behind locked doors. Emergency lights cast thin lines across the hallway, slicing the darkness into functional geometry. I like this version of the place better. No witnesses, no distortion. I rolled my chair closer to the desk and opened the master file. Not the presentation he had seen, not the version circulated internally with softened language and shared credit. This was the clean one. Metrics without narrative cushioning. Decisions mapped directly to outcomes. Dates aligned with shifts. Everything traceable. I didn't rush. Preparation isn't speed, it's depth. Anyone can assemble slides. Very few people understand what must not be left unsaid. I rebuilt the opening section first, removed adjectives, replaced vague terms like optimization and realignment with measurable actions, reduced timelines to exact intervals. Clarity unnerves people who rely on ambiguity to maintain authority. Halfway through, I paused and leaned back, eyes unfocusing. His voice replayed again, uninvited. Stay home. Not work remotely, not take the day. Stay home. As if my presence itself was a variable to be managed. As if visibility were dangerous rather than accountability. I smiled to myself and kept going. The slides grew leaner, sharper. No animations, no decorative transitions. Just data arranged in a way that made causality impossible to miss. If someone asked why the numbers changed, the answer would already be on the screen, waiting. At some point, I realized I was humming softly under my breath. A habit from long nights like this, when focus narrows and the world shrinks to task and consequence. I checked the time. Past 10. The cleaning crew had already been through. trash cans emptied, coffee rings wiped from tables that wouldn't be used until morning. I got up and walked to the window. The city stretched below, indifferent and relentless. Offices like mine dotted the skyline, each one filled with its own quiet conflicts, its own small wars of perception and power. So many people mistook stability for safety. They forgot that systems reward whoever understands them best, not whoever inherited control. Back at my desk, I opened a second file. Supporting documentation, emails, approvals, calendar invites, decision points. I hadn't kept them out of paranoia. I kept them because memory becomes unreliable under pressure, and pressure was tomorrow's currency. If questions came framed as confusion, I would answer them with timestamps. I imagined the room, the table, the polished surface reflecting faces trained to reveal nothing. Executives don't raise their voices. They don't accuse. They ask neutral questions and wait to see who sweats. I wasn't worried. I was worried once, years ago, when I still believed performance alone guaranteed recognition. Experience corrects that misconception brutally. Performance creates leverage, not protection. You have to decide when to apply it. I saved the files locally and backed them up twice. Old habit? Then I shut the laptop but didn't stand immediately. Instead, I let my hands rest on the closed surface, grounding myself in the weight of what I'd built. Flawless doesn't mean perfect. It means defensible. By the time I turned off my desk lamp, the night outside was fully dark. The office behind me disappeared with a soft click, sealing in quiet like a vault. On the elevator ride down, my reflection looked different than it had earlier. Not more confident, just more resolved, as if some internal negotiation had concluded. Outside, the air was cooler, the street nearly empty. I walked instead of ordering a car, letting the rhythm of my steps finalize decisions I'd already made. Tomorrow wasn't about confrontation. It was about presence. If I stayed home, the story would be written without me. Carefully, politely. I would be referenced as an abstraction, my work folded into someone else's narrative. If I showed up, the narrative would have to adjust. By the time I reached my building, the certainty felt absolute. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, doesn't need reinforcement. It simply exists. I set my alarm for early morning and placed the phone face down. Tomorrow, at 9 sharp, I would walk in. Not to prove anything. To be exact. I arrived at exactly 9. Not a minute early. Anticipation reads as eagerness. Not a minute late. Lateness invites interpretation. 9 meant unassailable neutrality. The doors slid open, and the familiar scent of polished surfaces and filtered air greeted me without ceremony. The office was already awake, but not alive yet. Conversations were low, cautious. People sensed something before they understood it. As I walked toward the conference wing, I felt it. The subtle shift in attention. Not turning heads, not outright stares. Just the awareness that my presence registered as unexpected data. Schedules had been adjusted, assumptions made, and now quietly, those assumptions were recalculating. He was there. Standing near the glass-walled conference room, jacket on, posture rigid in that way that pretends to be relaxed. His expression changed almost imperceptibly when he saw me. A fraction of a second too slow. Like a system encountering input it hadn't been programmed to handle. "You were supposed to," he started. I didn't stop walking. "I'm on schedule," I said calmly as I passed him and placed my notebook on the table. The sentence wasn't confrontation. It was a correction. Around us, chairs were being moved, laptops opened. The low murmur of pre-meeting noise filled the space, a shield of normalcy. He stood there for another moment, watching me as if proximity might restore control. It didn't. "We discussed this yesterday," he said, lowering his voice. I looked up at him then. "Just long enough. You made a request. You didn't give an order." His lips pressed together. For a moment, I wondered if he would escalate, if he would try to turn this into a public contest of authority before witnesses arrived. That would have been a mistake. Even he understood that. He seated himself opposite me without another word. The executives arrived at 9:02, punctual in the way people are when they expect compliance. Introductions followed. Handshakes. Polite exchanges stripped of warmth. I watched faces, cataloged micro-expressions, interest, fatigue, mild skepticism. None of them looked at me for long, and that was fine. Yet. He opened the meeting. His voice was steady, but the rhythm was wrong. Too careful. Every point carefully framed. Every phrase padded with qualifiers. He spoke the way people do when they know something might be taken from them and are trying not to reveal where it hurts. Slides appeared on the screen behind him. Familiar, softened versions of work I recognized. Collective language. Shared credit. Plausible ambiguity. He advanced through them methodically, explaining growth as if it had emerged naturally, the way weather does. 3 minutes in, it happened. One of the executives, a woman with silver hair cut precisely at the jawline, tilted her head slightly. Her gaze shifted from the screen to me. Not a glance, a focus. "Did you lead this project?" she asked. The room froze, not dramatically, just enough. I stood. The movement felt almost ceremonial, like stepping into alignment with gravity. I didn't rush. I didn't smile. "Yes," I said. No elaboration. None was needed. He turned toward me sharply, then caught himself. His hand twitched toward his notes and then stopped. The executive nodded once, as if something had just fallen into place. "Please," she said, "walk us through the drivers." The click of the remote sounded louder than it should have when it changed hands. I began. My voice didn't try to impress. It informed. Each metric led naturally to the next, each shift explained by a decision grounded in constraint and outcome. I didn't frame the work as effort. Effort is irrelevant. I framed it as logic. As I spoke, I felt the room recalibrate around me, not in my favor yet, but toward coherence. Questions followed, precise and demanding. I answered each one fully and moved on before doubt could take root. Across the table, he had gone still. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't. To do so would have required challenging facts he himself had approved. Silence gathered around him like a verdict still being written. When I finished, I sat down. The screen went dark. For half a second, no one spoke. Then the meeting continued, not as it had been intended, but as it now had to. He remained quiet for the rest of it, eyes fixed on the table. Not angry, not defensive. Replaced. As the executives gathered their papers and stood to leave, something settled in me. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Just certainty. The kind that arrives when a reality becomes unavoidable. 9 a.m. had passed, and nothing was hiding anymore. They arrived exactly when power prefers to arrive, without apology and without delay. The conference room doors closed behind the last executive with a soft, airtight click, sealing us into a space designed for decisions rather than discussion. The table was too long, the chairs slightly too heavy, the lighting engineered to eliminate shadows. Everything in the room suggested permanence. Authority likes to believe it will outlast the people who pass through it. He took his place at the head of the table by reflex. No one had told him to. Habits form when they go unquestioned for long enough, and he had occupied that seat for years without resistance. Power, when uninterrupted, grows lazy. It assumes continuity. I observed quietly as the executive settled in. No unnecessary gestures, no wasted movement. Their calm was different from his. It wasn't performative. It was earned through repetition. They had replaced people before. Many people. The process no longer carried drama for them. He began again, clearing his throat softly, launching into context as if the interruption earlier had merely been a technical issue now resolved. His voice regained some momentum, confidence scraping its way back into the edges of his sentences. He spoke of market conditions, organizational resilience, long-term projections, language designed to reassure rather than reveal. I listened without reaction. Every claim he made floated slightly above the data, never touching it directly. That distance was intentional. If things went well, he could lean closer and claim substance. If things faltered, he could retreat into abstraction. It was how he had always operated. 3 slides in, one of the executives leaned back in their chair, not away from the screen, away from him. "Let's pause here," the woman said. Her voice was calm, controlled, curious rather than confrontational. He stopped mid-sentence, mask resetting instantly. "Of course." She tapped a manicured finger once against the table, eyes returning to me. "Not accidentally, not as a courtesy. The growth curve here doesn't behave like the others we've seen this year. It's too stable, too intentional." A pause. Not for effect, for assessment. "Who structured it?" This time, there was no freeze, no ambiguity. I stood. The chair slid back with a soft, deliberate sound that felt louder than any words. Standing didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like alignment, like gravity finally acting in the expected direction. I did. Still no qualifiers. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. The silence next to me shifted, tightened. I could feel the recalibration without turning my head. "Walk us through it," another executive said. "Not a request. A correction, of course." I stepped closer to the screen, rested one hand lightly on the table, and began where it actually started. 2 years earlier, when failure had been normalized and no one expected consistency. I explained the initial constraints without dramatization, budget limits, legacy systems, cultural resistance. Then I outlined the framework I built inside those constraints, showing how each decision reduced variance rather than amplified risk. I didn't speak quickly. Speed suggests persuasion. Precision suggests ownership. Questions came immediately. Not aggressive, exact. What assumptions were challenged first? Where resistance appeared strongest? Which metric mattered more than leadership expected? Every answer had a reference point, a timestamp, a trade-off. I didn't frame obstacles as enemies. Systems don't resist change maliciously, they resist inefficiency. Fix that, and they cooperate. Somewhere behind me, I heard him shift in his chair. A sound so small it almost escaped notice. Almost. The room had changed, not toward admiration, toward clarity. I saw it in the way they stopped looking at the decorative slides and started looking at the raw tables, in the way follow-up questions were directed at me without hesitation, without checking whether he should respond first. Authority was reassigning itself organically, without ceremony. He hadn't been removed. He had been bypassed. That's the part people underestimate. Demotion rarely comes announced. More often, it arrives quietly, through exclusion. By the time I finished, the atmosphere wasn't tense. It was settled, as if a calculation had concluded and returned a clean result. The woman nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Thank you," she said. "Not good presentation. Not impressive work. Thank you. The kind reserved for inevitability." He didn't speak again. As chairs shifted and folders closed, I finally allowed myself a glance in his direction. His eyes were fixed not on me, not on the executives, but on the table, as if the polished surface might offer an explanation he'd missed. What he failed to understand was simple. The arrival wasn't theirs, it was mine. Control is quieter than people expect. It doesn't announce itself with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It settles into a room the way temperature does, gradually, then all at once. By the time anyone notices it, the adjustment has already been made. I spoke clearly, precisely, without ornament. The screen filled with numbers that didn't require interpretation, only attention. Graphs don't negotiate. Lines either move or they don't. Trends either stabilize or collapse. I let the data breathe, resisted the urge to defend it. Defense implies vulnerability, and this work no longer needed protection. As I moved through the material, I felt the rhythm of the room change. People leaned forward. Pens stopped spinning, questions sharpened. Not "why did you do this?" but "what happens if this scales?" Not skepticism, interest. That distinction matters. He sat beside me in silence, not the stiff silence of forced restraint. Something deeper. He had entered the phase no one prepares for, the moment when speaking carries more risk than staying quiet. Every interruption would have required authority he could no longer deploy without challenge. Every correction would have demanded data he didn't have. So he said nothing. For the first time in a long while, the silence was correct. I answered questions as they came, not rushing to fill gaps. I allowed pauses to stretch just enough to remind everyone that I wasn't improvising. Improvisation flatters charisma. Preparation establishes inevitability. One of the executives asked about sustainability. "Stability is not passive," I replied. "It's engineered. Left alone, systems decay. This one doesn't, because it's monitored and adjusted continuously." Another asked about succession, framed casually, as if it were hypothetical. "The framework isn't dependent on any single individual," I said. "It's documented, modular, and transferable." I felt him stiffen beside me at that word. Transferable. Even outcomes can be removed from their original owners if they aren't protected by relevance. The questions flowed past him now, no longer orbiting the seat at the head of the table. I didn't redirect them. I didn't have to. Authority follows competence when it's allowed to observe long enough. At one point, I became aware that I was no longer standing at the edge of the room. I had shifted closer to the center without consciously deciding to. No one objected. Chairs angled subtly toward me. Alignment isn't negotiated. It happens when resistance disappears. I glanced at the time. We were ahead of schedule. That never happens unless something has gone very right, or very wrong. As I concluded the final section, I closed the laptop gently. The sound was soft but definitive, like punctuation. I didn't rush to add a summary. Summaries are for people afraid of being misunderstood. Everything that needed to be said was already visible. There was a beat of silence, not awkward, reflective. Then one of them nodded. "This is solid control," they said. "Operational, strategic, control." The word hung there, suspended between us. I didn't look at him when it was spoken. I didn't need to. Control had already moved. You can feel it shift when it leaves. It takes a certain kind of energy with it. The kind that lets you believe a room belongs to you simply because it always has. For the rest of the session, discussions continued as if the question of leadership had already been resolved privately. Forward planning, resource allocation, expansion. I participated where appropriate, deferred where strategic, said no twice without apology. He remained present but peripheral, a body occupying space someone else was now directing around. When the meeting finally adjourned, chairs pushed back and people stood. The room felt lighter. Decisions do that. They reduce mental load. As executives collected their materials, one of them offered a brief smile. Not personal, not warm. Professional acknowledgement. The kind that signals recognition without attachment. I nodded once in return. He stayed seated. I gathered my things with deliberate calm and stood. For a moment, I considered saying something, anything. But silence had already said more than words could. Control doesn't require announcement. It simply remains when everything else has finished speaking. When the screen went dark, the room didn't rush to fill the space it left behind. That was how I knew the moment mattered. I closed my laptop slowly, not out of hesitation, but precision. The click echoed softly, marking an end that required no emphasis. People were still processing, not the data, but its implications. Information settles faster than power shifts. I could have stopped there. That was the clean exit, the safe one. Control established, authority realigned, nothing overtly challenged. I had already won in every way that would appear reasonable on record. Silence would have preserved that neatness. But neatness wasn't the point. I looked up, met the gaze of the silver-haired executive, then let my eyes sweep the table once, not lingering anywhere too long. Balance matters in moments like this. You don't aim, you include. By the way, I said, my tone conversational, almost incidental. That did it. Heads turned, not sharply, just enough. This is the man who refers to his employees as misunderstandings. The word arrived intact this time, unsoftened, unprotected. I didn't gesture toward him. I didn't need to. Everyone knew exactly who I meant. The sentence didn't accuse, it identified. Facts have a way of doing that without raising their voice. I thought you should know who's running your team. Then I stopped speaking. No explanation followed. None was invited. The silence that came next was different from the others that morning. This one had edges. It didn't rush to be resolved because there was nothing ambiguous left to clarify. The statement stood alone, balanced carefully between professionalism and exposure. No one challenged it. No one asked for context. That was worse than confrontation. Questions would have meant uncertainty. Pushback would have suggested debate. But what followed instead was stillness, the kind that indicates assessment has moved beyond whether something happened and toward what must be done about it. I became acutely aware of him beside me, not through movement, he hadn't moved at all, but through absence. A vacuum where influence had been moments ago. Power, when stripped suddenly, leaves space behind. It's almost physical. The executive closest to him glanced down at their notes, then closed the folder without looking up. Another adjusted their watch. Minor gestures, individually meaningless, collectively definitive. This was no longer a meeting. It was a verdict forming quietly. He opened his mouth. No sound came out. He closed it again. I didn't look at him. Engagement would have implied equality. This moment wasn't about exchange. It was about record. The line had been drawn, not emotionally, but administratively. Words now existed that couldn't be unsaid, attributed to him without embellishment. The silver-haired executive nodded once, the kind of nod that concludes internal deliberation. "Thank you for sharing that," she said. Not we'll take that into consideration. Not that's concerning. Thank you. Then she turned to the others. Let's continue. And just like that, the meeting moved forward. No comment, no reaction, no visible consequence yet. But he had been erased from the center of it. Discussion resumed, voices calm, topics shifting seamlessly into future planning. He wasn't included, not deliberately excluded, simply no longer addressed. Authority didn't withdraw from him aggressively. It evaporated. I answered questions, clarified projections, took notes when requested. I didn't speak more than necessary. Control doesn't require volume. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him finally lower his gaze to the table. There it was. Not anger, not humiliation, recognition. The realization that a single sentence, accurate, documented, spoken aloud, can undo years of careful positioning. He had relied on language to blur responsibility. I had used it to sharpen it. When the meeting concluded, people stood gradually, conversations forming quietly at the edges of the room. I packed my things without haste. Timing had done all the work for me. As I turned to leave, I felt his eyes on me again. This time, I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I didn't acknowledge him at all. That was the line, and it was irreversible. The meeting didn't end so much as it moved on without him. There was no announcement, no formal gesture to mark the transition. No one asked him for clarification. No one sought his approval. The conversation simply reoriented itself, like a compass needle finding a stronger magnetic field. I felt it happen in increments, subtle, cumulative, undeniable. Questions came toward me now by default, not because I demanded them, not because anyone declared a change. They came because momentum had shifted, and attention followed competence the way water follows gravity. It's not personal, it's structural. If we scale this across regions, what breaks first? How resilient is the framework under acquisition pressure? Which assumptions are you least attached to? Each question assumed continuity, assumed my presence beyond this room, assumed responsibility. I answered without possession or hesitation, clarified limits, named risks, offered alternatives. I admitted uncertainty where it existed, precisely because it existed. Credibility isn't built by pretending you know everything. It's built by showing exactly where knowledge ends and what you'll do when it does. He stared at the table, not at his notes, not at the screen, at the glossy surface in front of him, as if it might reflect a version of events he could still manipulate. I wondered what was happening behind his expression, whether he was rehearsing defenses, whether he was hoping someone would rescue him with an interruption. No one did. At one point, one of the executives turned slightly in their seat, angling their body away from him entirely. It was subtle, likely unconscious, but it carried meaning. Seating positions adjust when hierarchies do. "We'll need someone to oversee implementation," the woman said, scanning her notes. She looked at me. "You'll have bandwidth? Not would you. Not can you. Will you?" "I will," I said. That was it. No negotiation, no follow-up. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief, not exhilaration. Something quieter. The sense of stepping from analysis into execution, from proving to doing. That transition has always mattered more to me than recognition. As the discussion wrapped, I noticed how quickly consensus formed now that there was no ambiguity about direction. Without competing authority, decisions accelerated. The meeting that had begun with hesitation was ending with clarity. He pushed his chair back slightly, then stopped, as if unsure whether leaving early would register as defiance or surrender. In the end, he stayed seated until others stood. When people began gathering their things, conversations formed in low tones, forward-looking, purposeful. He wasn't included. Again, not deliberately, just naturally. No one avoided him. They simply didn't adjust themselves toward him. That's how exclusion usually works at this level. Quiet, plausible, complete. I collected my notebook and slid it into my bag. As I straightened, our eyes met briefly across the table. For a moment, something passed between us. Not hostility, not regret, understanding. The belated kind. He looked older than he had the day before. I didn't offer anything to soften that realization. Softness would have been dishonest. Outside the conference room, the hallway had filled again with the normal rhythms of office life. Phones rang. Laughter surfaced from somewhere distant. People passed without knowing exactly what had just happened, only that something had. I walked through it all with the same pace I always maintained. No urgency, no pause. In the glass wall beside the elevators, I caught my reflection again. Still composed, still unreadable, but different in a way even I couldn't have described the day before. The shift wasn't about promotion or punishment. It was about reality asserting itself. Back at my desk, my email inbox was already changing. Invitations, follow-ups, access requests that hadn't existed that morning, quiet confirmations that the system had updated its assumptions. I exhaled slowly and sat. Power doesn't arrive with fanfare when it's real. It integrates. And by the end of the hour, he wasn't part of the process anymore. Not officially, not yet. But functionally, he already was somewhere else. The word didn't arrive in an email. That alone told me everything. Corporate decisions of consequence rarely travel through formal channels at first. They surface indirectly through careful phrasing, calendar adjustments, a pause where certainty used to live. Reassignment announces itself in negative space long before it crystallizes into policy. I was in the middle of reviewing documentation when my calendar updated. A block appeared where nothing had been scheduled before. Conversation, 2 p.m. No agenda, no location, just duration, 30 minutes. That was generous. At 2 sharp, I was escorted into an office 2 floors above mine, larger, quieter, deliberately anonymous. No personal touches, no photographs. Power doesn't decorate spaces it hasn't decided to occupy permanently. He was already there, not seated behind the desk. That mattered. He stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, posture rigid enough to suggest discipline rather than composure. When the door closed behind me, he turned slowly, as if rehearsing the movement. "Sit," he said, then corrected himself. "Please." I remained standing. "I'm fine." He nodded once, accepting the boundary without comment. That was new. Someone else entered then, HR, but not the kind that recites protocols. Senior, discreet. The kind that listens more than speaks and remembers everything. They didn't waste time. Based on recent assessment, the board has decided to restructure leadership oversight in your division, the HR representative said, voice neutral, precise. "This is an interim decision, effective immediately. Interim. Another elegant word. Temporary without implying reversibility. Provisional without comfort. Oversight responsibilities will transition elsewhere for the time being. Elsewhere meant away from me." He exhaled through his nose. A controlled release. He had known this was coming the moment the meeting continued without him. This was merely the formal alignment catching up to reality. "I understand," he said. His voice didn't crack. Credit where it's due. but something in him had already withdrawn, folded inward in anticipation of explanation, as if clarity might still grant him leverage. "You'll retain title for now," the representative continued. "However, day-to-day operations will be reassigned." They turned to me. "You'll assume continuity, not leadership. Continuity, the word that implies permanence without needing to promise it." "Understood," I said. That was all that was required. No handshake followed, no speech, no reassurance. HR gathered their notes and exited, leaving the room quiet enough that the hum of climate control filled the space between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he straightened. "This didn't have to happen like this," he said. I met his gaze for the first time since the meeting ended. "It happened exactly like this because of choices you made," I replied. Calmly. Precisely. His jaw tightened. "You went too far." I shook my head once. I answered a question, and I named a pattern. Silence again. Patterns are dangerous because once recognized, they can't be unseen. "You know what they'll say about you now," he said. "That you're difficult. That you don't know how to play the game." I almost smiled. "The game ended when the results became predictable," I said. "I didn't break anything. I removed ambiguity." He looked at me then with something close to disbelief. Not anger, confusion. "You could have waited. Let things settle." "Things were settled," I said quietly. "Just not in the open." I stepped back toward the door. "I didn't take anything from you. That wasn't true, but it wasn't false either. I stopped carrying what was never yours." When I left the office, the hallway felt longer than before, quieter, like a space after evacuation. I walked past familiar doors that had once opened to him without question, now just surfaces waiting to be reassigned. He passed me later in the corridor. For a brief second, we moved in parallel, close enough that I could hear his breath, feel the heat of another person recalibrating their place in the world. He slowed, as if expecting acknowledgement. I didn't look at him. He no longer warranted recognition. Reassignment isn't exile. It's something more surgical, a relocation of relevance. A week later, his office was mine. The transition wasn't ceremonial. No announcement circulated. No email proclaimed change. The key card access simply updated overnight, and the space became available the way unused bandwidth does, quietly, efficiently, without sentiment. I unlocked the door early, before the floor filled with people eager to interpret shifts they hadn't witnessed directly. The room smelled neutral, untouched since he'd left it. Corporate cleanliness has a way of erasing presence quickly. Personal artifacts were already gone. No photos, no books, just furniture and intent. Empty, functional, predictable. I walked the perimeter first, observing without hurry. Large desk, 2 chairs opposite it, positioned to imply hierarchy rather than conversation. A window overlooking the city, angled to reinforce the idea of oversight. It was a room designed to project control rather than practice it. I sat down and logged into the system. No resistance. Permissions aligned seamlessly. Dashboards populated. Pending decisions queued themselves in rational order, waiting to be resolved. The work didn't hesitate. Systems are loyal only to clarity. By mid-morning, the first executive visit request came through. Routine, scheduled, unconcerned. When they arrived later that day, there was no tension in the air, no hesitation. They walked into the office as if it had always belonged to me, handshake firm, eye contact brief, language direct. No one referenced what had happened. Resolution doesn't need rehearsal. We discussed timelines, resources, risk exposure. The conversation was efficient in a way I hadn't experienced before, uninterrupted by positioning, unclouded by ego. Questions were answered and accepted, decisions recorded and enacted. At one point, someone glanced around the room. "Everything in order?" they asked. I allowed myself a small nod. "Completely." That was true. Later, alone again, I stood by the window and watched the city move below. Cars flowed through intersections regardless of who occupied which office upstairs. Markets adjusted without memory. Systems recalibrated continuously, indifferent to individual loss or gain. Somewhere in the building, he was still here, temporarily, officially, quietly absorbing reassignment. Reflection elsewhere, they'd called it. Time to consider alignment. Organizations rarely say what they mean directly, but for once, the outcome matched the language. He didn't contact me. I didn't wonder why. The work filled the space he once occupied, not just physically, but conceptually. There was no void. There never is when something unnecessary is removed. As the week ended, I shut down my computer and stood, looking once more around the office. Nothing about it felt personal. That was a relief. Ownership, in my mind, isn't about imprinting yourself on a space. It's about making the space irrelevant to who sits in it. Now, when executives visit, there's nothing to hide. No softened narratives, no deliberate absences, no misunderstandings lurking at the edges of explanation. The system reflects what's real. And if someone wants to know who runs the team, there's no need for clarification. The misunderstanding has been corrected.